The rumor spread through the American lines like wildfire during the summer of 1944. The Germans had developed a new supertank, 70 tons of sheer power and steel, with armor so thick it could laugh off Sherman shells. Equipped with a gun so powerful it could obliterate anything the Allies could field from over 2 kilometers away. Allied intelligence identified it as the King Tiger. German crews dubbed it invincible, while American tankers referred to it as their worst nightmare. The first reports surfaced from British forces fighting around Quichen in Normandy. On July 11, 1944, the 53rd Heavy Panzer Battalion deployed King Tigers against Allied positions. British tank commanders radioed descriptions that seemed unbelievable, tanks larger than any encountered before, shells bouncing harmlessly off their thick armor, and German tanks firing from distances where British guns couldn't respond. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. American intelligence officers collected data from various sources, including British Second Army combat assessments and Soviet military intelligence from the Eastern Front, confirming the new threat. By August 1944, French resistance networks reported sightings of massive tanks being transported by rail through occupied France, all confirming that Germany had fielded a new class of armored vehicle that outmatched anything the Allies had. For months, rumors about this mechanical beast had spread. British units in Normandy had reported sightings, and Soviet intelligence corroborated it on the Eastern Front. Every Allied tanker knew the terrifying specifications: 180 millimeters of frontal armor on the turret, an 8.8 cm gun with a 6-meter-long barrel, and a combat weight heavier than anything on tracks. This wasn't just another tank. It was Germany's answer to Allied numerical superiority, a weapon designed to restore German dominance on the battlefield. The intelligence briefings were grim. The King Tiger weighed 69.8 tons, more than double the weight of a Sherman. Its 8.8 cm KWK-43 gun could penetrate 150 meters of armor at a range of 2,000 meters. Its sloped frontal armor, 180 millimeter thick on the turret and 150 millimeter on the hull, could defeat virtually every Allied anti-tank weapon in service. The impact on Allied forces was profound. American tank crews, who were accustomed to fighting Panzer IVs and Panthers, now faced a wholly different enemy. Intelligence reports painted a dark picture. The King Tiger could easily penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at any effective combat range, making return fire nearly impossible. It would take 4 or 5 Shermans to flank and destroy a single King Tiger, and the casualties would be high. The fear was real. British tankers shared their encounters with the King Tiger. One officer reported watching his squadron's shells bounce off its armor at 800 meters, while another witnessed a King Tiger destroying 3 Churchill tanks before retreating without suffering significant damage. These stories spread through Allied armored units, amplifying the King Tiger's legend of invincibility. Combat analysis favored the King Tiger in direct engagements. A Sherman's 75mm gun was ineffective against its frontal armor, and even the improved 76mm gun struggled to penetrate the sloped plates. British 17-pounder guns had a better chance, but only at close ranges, where the King Tiger's superior range gave the Germans the first shot. By early July 1944, 5 King Tigers were allocated to Normandy, part of the elite Panzer Division. These tanks represented the cutting edge of German armored warfare. Each one cost 321,500 Reichsmarks, equivalent to 3 smaller German tanks, and required production facilities that could have built 2 Panthers. These were not mass-produced vehicles. They were precision instruments of destruction, hand-built with German engineering excellence. The allocation of these tanks had symbolic weight, as German Armaments Minister Albert Speer had promised to increase the production of heavy tanks to counter the Allied numerical advantage. But production was slow. Skilled workers were scarce, and Allied bombing had disrupted the supply chain. Critical materials like tungsten and molybdenum became harder to obtain. Each completed King Tiger represented a triumph of German industrial resolve amidst mounting challenges. The crews assigned to these formidable machines were seasoned veterans, many from the Eastern Front. These were men who had survived Kursk and fought their way through countless Soviet encirclements. Now they were tasked with demonstrating the superiority of the King Tiger to the Americans and British. These veterans had unmatched expertise in tank warfare. They knew how to position their vehicles for maximum advantage, how to use terrain and sightlines to create kill zones where enemy tanks would be destroyed before they could get within range. In the King Tigers, they saw an unstoppable weapon. Upon seeing their new machines, these hardened soldiers felt a shift in their confidence. The King Tiger dwarfed everything around it. At 3 meters tall and over 10 meters long with its gun, it dominated the battlefield. Its sloped frontal armor would deflect shells like raindrops, and its powerful 8.8 cm KWK-43 gun promised to destroy anything in its sight. This was no mere tank. It was a fortress on tracks, a weapon that could change the course of the war. The crews began familiarization training, learning the quirks of the King Tiger's controls. The steering required more effort than lighter tanks, and the transmission demanded careful shifting to avoid damage. The fuel consumption was staggering, 190 gallons to travel 120 kilometers on roads, and even worse, off-road. But these seemed like acceptable sacrifices for the overwhelming firepower the King Tiger provided. By mid-July, the first King Tigers began their journey from their assembly area to the front lines near Tilly and St. Lo, a mere 80 kilometers across French countryside. The crews performed their final checks with meticulous care, ensuring that everything was in perfect condition. The tanks were fresh from the Henschel factory, built with the finest German engineering. What could possibly go wrong? As the Maybach HL230P30 engine roared to life, the first King Tiger began its journey with unshakable confidence. Unaware of the challenges that lay ahead, the King Tigers rolled forward, a symbol of German strength, as the crew and commanders stood proudly, eager to demonstrate their superiority. But barely 10 kilometers into the journey, the first breakdown occurred. The lead tank's transmission emitted the dreaded sounds of grinding metal. The driver, trying to compensate by shifting carefully and reducing speed, saw no improvement. The gearbox, stressed beyond its limits by the tank's excessive weight, had failed. Within minutes, the King Tiger ground to a halt on a rural French road, blocking the entire column behind it. The crew was stunned. This couldn't be happening, not now, not to Germany's most advanced tank. Immediate repairs were ordered, but the mechanics quickly delivered grim news. The transmission was catastrophically damaged. The internal gears had stripped, and the tank would need to be towed back for a complete gearbox replacement. Moving it would require another King Tiger or a large recovery vehicle, neither of which was immediately available. The Maybach OV-1216B transmission, used in the King Tiger, was essentially the same as that in the 45-ton Panther tank, with no significant strengthening to handle the added 25 tons of weight. Under the stress of moving 70 tons, the gears stripped, bearings failed, and synchronizers wore out. This wasn't an isolated defect, it was a design flaw. 1 tank down, 4 to go. The column reorganized and continued, hoping this was just bad luck and a manufacturing defect. The war couldn't be won by standing still. The front lines were waiting, and American and British forces were advancing. The remaining 4 King Tigers pressed on, though their commanders, now a bit less confident, were still determined to reach combat. Another 15 kilometers, and the second King Tiger began experiencing engine trouble. The Maybach engine, adequate for the 45-ton Panther, was underpowered for the 70-ton King Tiger. The power-to-weight ratio was a mere 10 horsepower per ton, far below what was needed for sustained operations. As the King Tiger climbed a modest hill, the engine temperature rose. The cooling system, already marginal, couldn't handle the excessive heat generated by the engine running at maximum output just to maintain basic speed. The driver watched in horror as the temperature gauges entered the red zone. Despite reducing speed in hopes of cooling the engine, It made no difference. The coolant began to boil, and soon steam billowed from the engine compartment. Within minutes, the engine seized, with pistons expanding in their cylinders, unable to move. The tank came to a stop, smoke rising from the engine deck. German engineers had anticipated the power deficit early in development. The Maybach HL230 P30 engine, with 700 horsepower, was identical to that in the lighter Panther tank. Plans for a more powerful Maybach 234 engine producing 800 horsepower had existed, but were delayed due to production issues, leaving most King Tigers with the inadequate HL230. The result was inevitable. Prolonged operations at high power output led to overheating, which caused cascading mechanical failures. 2 down, 3 remaining. The pattern was becoming clear, and panic started to set in among the remaining crews. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systemic failures. Despite its formidable armor and firepower, the King Tiger had a fatal flaw. It was too heavy for its own drivetrain. The engine, transmission, and cooling system were all pushed beyond their design limits. What seemed invincible on the test range was proving to be a liability in combat. The third tank managed another 20 kilometers before its final drive failed. The massive gears, connecting the transmission to the drive sprockets, couldn't handle the torque required to move 70 tons across rugged terrain. The teeth stripped and the drivetrain seized. The tank ground to a halt, the crew exchanging looks of growing despair. The final drive issue would continue to plague the King Tiger throughout its service. A report from Schwerpanzerabteilung 506 in September 1944 noted that 12 final drive housings failed after just 50 to 100 kilometers of use. Sprocket teeth broke off, track tension devices repeatedly failed, and the battalion commander had to request an urgent meeting with armaments officials to address the crisis. 3 down, 2 remaining. The company commander now faced an impossible situation. Of the 5 King Tigers that had set out that morning, only 2 remained operational, and they hadn't even reached the front lines. They hadn't fired a single shot or engaged a single enemy tank. They had simply tried to drive 80 kilometers on roads, and 60% of the force had fallen apart mechanically. The commander made the only decision he could. He ordered the remaining 2 tanks to continue at a reduced speed, hoping their overworked engines and transmissions would hold together long enough to reach friendly lines. Behind them lay 3 of Germany's most advanced tanks, not immobilized by enemy action, but by their own engineering. The 4th King Tiger failed 30 kilometers from the front, suffering suspension problems. The overlapping road wheel design, intended to distribute the tank's massive weight, proved prone to damage. A wheel bearing seized, locking up the wheel and causing the track to derail. The tank tilted slightly to one side and came to a complete stop. 4 down, 1 remaining. Only 1 King Tiger from the original 5 managed to reach German positions near Tilly. Just 1 out of 5, a 20% success rate. The crew of the lone survivor glanced back at the trail of disabled tanks behind them, realizing the terrible truth. Germany's super tank was far from super. It was over-engineered, overstressed, and fundamentally flawed. But the story didn't end there. These 5 King Tigers, chassis numbers 28,001 through 28,005, were the first units produced in March 1944, equipped with early production Porsche turrets. They were assigned to the 316 Funklank Panzer Company, a specialized unit for radio-controlled demolition vehicles. When the unit deployed to Normandy in June 1944, these 5 King Tigers were deemed too unreliable for combat operations. The commander, facing urgent operational needs, chose to re-equip the unit with 9 Sturm Tiger assault guns, reliable and immediately available. The King Tigers were abandoned at Chateau-d'Un, about 200 kilometers from the front lines. By mid-August 1944, as Allied forces advanced through France, these 5 tanks became a liability. The Germans lacked the recovery equipment to move the 70-ton tanks, and they didn't have spare parts for the complex drivetrains. The decision was made to destroy them rather than risk them falling into Allied hands. Demolition charges were placed on the turrets, and the tanks were left beside the French roads. Within days, American forces began encountering these abandoned King Tigers. The first crews who saw them approached cautiously, expecting ambush, expecting fire from those feared 8.8 cm guns. Instead, they found silence, empty tanks, hatches open, and the crews long gone. The Germans, unable to repair or recover these colossal machines, had left them to rust. American tankers could hardly believe their eyes when they encountered the King Tigers. They had been told these machines were invincible, warned that meeting a King Tiger meant almost certain death. Yet here they sat, lifeless and defeated, not by American firepower, but by the flawed German engineering that had built them. The first intact King Tiger captured by American forces became a goldmine for intelligence. Technical teams from the First Army arrived with cameras, measuring devices, and cutting tools, accompanied by engineers from the Ordnance Department and British liaison officers. The examination process would take several days, and the reports produced circulated throughout the Allied command. Engineers and technical specialists meticulously studied every inch of the captured tank. They aimed to uncover its capabilities, weaknesses, and how to effectively defeat it. What they discovered shocked them to their core. The armor was indeed formidable, with 100 mm at the turret front sloped at 80 degrees and 150 on the hull front sloped at 50 degrees. This was armor that could withstand almost every American and British tank gun in service. Shells that would have penetrated a Panther tank simply bounced off the King Tiger's glacis plate. From the front, this tank appeared nearly invincible. Test firings against captured armor plates confirmed that the standard 75 mm Sherman rounds couldn't penetrate the King Tiger at any range. Even the improved 76 mm rounds struggled against the thick sloped armor. The gun was equally impressive. The 8.8 cm LUK-43 could penetrate 5 inches of armor at 2,000 meters. This weapon outranged, outgunned, and outclassed every Allied tank cannon. In the direct gunnery duel at long range, the King Tiger had every advantage. It used separate loading ammunition with the projectile and propellant charge loaded independently. This reduced the rate of fire compared to single-piece ammunition, but allowed for much higher muzzle velocities and greater penetration. American engineers measured the barrel length at 6.3 meters, which was over 7.1 times the caliber. They thoroughly examined the breech mechanism, recoil system, and mounting, all of which were built to exceptional standards. The optics, particularly the German Zeiss range-finding equipment, were noted for being the best in the world, enabling the King Tiger crew to identify and engage targets at ranges where Allied tanks could barely detect them. However, as the engineers began inspecting the drivetrain, the reality of the tank's flaws began to emerge. The transmission was the same basic design used in the 45-ton Panther, a tank much lighter than the 70-ton King Tiger. The gears were not significantly reinforced, nor were the bearings noticeably larger. German engineers had essentially taken a transmission designed for a medium tank and expected it to handle the demands of a super-heavy tank. The result was inevitable. Under sustained operation, the transmission components failed. Engineers found clear evidence of this throughout the captured vehicle. Wear patterns on gear teeth indicated excessive loading. Bearing races showed signs of scoring, and the synchronizer rings were worn thin. An American mechanical engineer from Detroit, who analyzed the transmission, wrote in his report that no automobile manufacturer in the United States would have approved such a drivetrain for a vehicle of this weight. The design margins were simply insufficient. The engine situation was even worse. The Maybach HL230P30 produced 700 horsepower, which was adequate for the 45-ton Panther, but it was woefully underpowered for the 70-ton King Tiger. The power-to-weight ratio was barely 10 horsepower per ton. By comparison, the American Sherman, weighing just 30 tons and powered by a 400 horsepower engine, achieved a power-to-weight ratio of over 13 horsepower per ton. The King Tiger, in fact, was less mobile than the very tank it was meant to dominate. American engineers calculated the fuel consumption based on tank capacity and operational ranges, and the numbers were staggering. The King Tiger carried 860 liters of fuel in its internal tanks, providing approximately 120 kilometers of road range under ideal conditions. Off-road, the range was significantly lower, perhaps 80 to 90 kilometers. Combat operations with frequent maneuvers, acceleration, and high power demands could drain the tanks in less than 60 km. In contrast, the Sherman carried 660 liters of fuel and could travel up to 200 kilometers on roads. The King Tiger required 30% more fuel to travel 40% less distance. This massive fuel inefficiency had devastating logistical implications. A German armored column equipped with King Tigers would require almost twice as many fuel trucks as a comparable American formation. In 1944, with Germany facing severe fuel shortages, this disadvantage proved crippling. The cooling system was another weakness. Engineers examined the radiators, coolant passages, and cooling fans. While these were adequately designed for normal operations, the King Tiger rarely operated under normal conditions. The underpowered engine ran at high output constantly, generating excessive heat. The cooling system could not dissipate heat fast enough, causing the coolant to boil and pressure to build up, leading to gasket failure and engine seizure. Evidence from the Eastern Front corroborated these findings. Soviet forces captured 2 King Tigers in August 1944 near Sandomierz, Poland, and transported them to the Kubinka proving grounds near Moscow for detailed testing. The Soviet engineers subjected the King Tigers to the same rigorous trials they applied to their own tanks. The results were damning. The tanks broke down every 10 to 15 kilometers in hot weather, with the cooling system failing repeatedly when ambient temperatures exceeded 30 degrees. The gearbox also overheated due to insufficient cooling, and the hot external environment contributed to further mechanical failures. One tank's gearbox failed completely during the transfer to Kubinka. The other's right suspension required complete replacement, and full functionality could not be restored even with the German spare parts captured alongside the tanks. Once at Kubinka, Soviet engineers tested the King Tigers across various terrain types, measured fuel consumption, tested maximum speed, and evaluated reliability. They found that the King Tiger broke down constantly in hot weather, with the gearbox, suspension, and cooling systems all failing repeatedly. Soviet engineers also tested the King Tiger's armor by firing captured German 88mm guns at it. While the King Tiger's armor could resist enemy fire, they discovered that the King Tiger's own gun could penetrate the turret of another King Tiger at 400 meters. This demonstrated the power of the gun, but also exposed weaknesses in the armor, particularly in the welding quality, which was noticeably inferior to that of earlier German tanks, such as the WWII. The final drive, which connected the transmission to the tracks, was another major weakness confirmed by both American and Soviet tests. The gears, responsible for transmitting enormous torque to move the 70-ton tank, failed regularly under combat stresses such as maneuvering, turning in place, and reversing quickly. Multiple captured King Tigers exhibited signs of final drive failure, and the problem was so severe that German commanders issued directives warning crews against unnecessary maneuvers that would stress the final drives. American engineers compiled these findings into detailed reports, and an intelligence bulletin issued by the First Army in September 1944 highlighted the King Tiger's mechanical shortcomings. The reports revealed that the tank, despite its impressive firepower and armor, was ultimately a liability on the battlefield due to its design flaws. The 1944 technical report on the King Tiger circulated through Allied armored units. providing tank commanders with precise information about both the strengths and weaknesses of the German supertank. The conclusion was remarkable. While the King Tiger was formidable in direct combat, it was ultimately its own worst enemy. Its excessive weight made it a maintenance nightmare, and its underpowered engine severely limited strategic mobility. The complex transmission required constant attention, and the suspension often clogged with mud, especially in winter conditions, when freezing temperatures would lock the overlapping wheels solid. The assessment concluded that a King Tiger in a defensive ambush was a terrifying threat, with its gun and armor providing decisive advantages. However, a King Tiger on the offensive, moving across country and advancing for hours or days, would likely break down before engaging the enemy. The longer the advance, the higher the breakdown rate. The more complex the terrain, the more stress was placed on already overworked systems. This understanding led to an immediate shift in American tactical doctrine. Instead of fearing the King Tiger as an invincible predator, commanders now saw it as a powerful but fragile weapon. The solution was no longer to engage it in a direct gunnery duel, but to force it to move, advance, and maneuver. Every kilometer it traveled increased the chance of mechanical failure. Every hill it climbed stressed the engine, and every turn wore down its transmission. Allied forces also learned that the King Tiger, due to its immense weight, could not cross most bridges. It was too heavy for standard military bridging equipment. Engineers calculated that the King Tiger's ground pressure, despite its wide tracks, was still substantial. Bridges rated for 50 tons could not support a 70-ton tank. Rivers that other German tanks could cross were now impassable barriers. This meant that King Tiger movements were constrained to specific routes, making them predictable and vulnerable to air attack. The fuel consumption was staggering compared to Allied vehicles. A King Tiger burned 190 gallons to travel just 120 kilometers on roads. And off-road, the consumption was even worse, sometimes reaching twice that rate. In comparison, a Sherman could travel over 200 kilometers on similar fuel. This meant that King Tigers required massive logistical support, a supply train that Germany could no longer sustain by late 1944. Perhaps most revealing was the production bottleneck. Germany built just 492 King Tigers throughout the war. Production began in January 1944 and continued until March 1945. One tank in 1943, 379 in 1944, and just 112 in 1945. By comparison, Germany produced 35,000 Panzer tanks, 6,000 Panthers, and America built 50,000 Shermans. For the resources consumed by a single King Tiger, Germany could have produced 3 Panthers or 5 Panzer IVs. The math of industrial warfare was unforgiving. Allied strategic bombing contributed heavily to the low production numbers. Royal Air Force Bomber Command targeted the Henschel factory in Kassel repeatedly throughout 1944. Raids in September and October destroyed machine tools, disrupted assembly lines, and killed skilled workers. Production fell from over 100 King Tigers per month during the summer of 1944 to just 30 per month by year's end. Each bombing raid set production back weeks, as workers cleared rubble, repaired machinery, and re-established workflow. The Schwerpanzerabteilung 501 arrived on the Eastern Front in August 1944 with 45 King Tigers. But only 8 were operational when they reached the battlefield. 37 of the tanks had broken down during transit. 37 brand new tanks, mechanically defeated before they could even fire a shot. This was not an army preparing for victory, but one watching its most advanced weapons fail from internal problems. The battalion had departed from Padborn on August 5, 1944, bound for southeastern Poland, covering roughly 800 kilometers by rail. Even rail transport proved problematic, as the King Tigers were too heavy for many standard railway cars. Special heavy-duty flat cars were required, and loading and unloading needed specialized ramps. The weight distribution had to be managed carefully to prevent car failure. Several King Tigers were damaged during loading when ramps collapsed under the excessive weight. After draining near the Vistula River, the battalion began a 50-kilometer road march to their assigned positions. What should have been a short movement quickly turned into a disaster. Final drive failures occurred first, with tanks grinding to a halt as drive sprockets failed under load. Then the transmissions began failing. Gear synchronizers broke, bearings seized, and clutches burned out. Within 2 days, 37 of 45 King Tigers were immobilized, awaiting repair. The 8 operational King Tigers that managed to reach the front lines immediately entered combat against Soviet forces near Barono Sandys. On August 11th and 12th, 1944, these King Tigers faced T-34-85s in close-range combat around the town of Uglando. 3 King Tigers were destroyed in an ambush, hit from the side, where the armor was thinner. Ammunition explosions killed most of the crew members. This engagement led to a tactical change. German armored doctrine had previously stored main gun ammunition in the turret for easy access. The losses at Oglandau demonstrated that turret hits could cause catastrophic ammunition fires. After this battle, King Tigers began storing their main gun ammunition in hull racks, reducing the ready rounds, but significantly improving crew survival in the event of a turret penetration. This modification reduced the ammunition capacity from 84 rounds to 68 rounds. By March 1945, German records showed that King Tigers had a 59% operational readiness rate, meaning that nearly half of the tanks were broken down and awaiting repairs at any given time. The same statistics from March 15, 1945, showed that King Tigers had a better operational readiness rate than the Panther, which stood at 48%. However, the King Tiger was still far less reliable than older, simpler designs like the Panzer IV. This improvement in readiness came only after extensive field experience. Henschel engineers worked closely with field units to identify and address mechanical problems. Modified seals, improved gaskets, and strengthened drivetrain components helped reduce wear. A new track design with wider links distributed the tank's massive weight more effectively. Improved driver training reduced mechanical abuse, and better maintenance procedures allowed issues to be caught before they became catastrophic failures. By early 1945, the King Tiger was a far more reliable vehicle than the early production models. However, Germany's lack of fuel, spare parts, and industrial capacity made it impossible to sustain this improved readiness. The Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, provided the ultimate test for the King Tiger's reliability under combat conditions. The 1st SS Panzer Division, led by Sepp Dietrich, included approximately 45 King Tigers from Schwer SS Panzer Abteilung 501. The plan was for a rapid advance to capture bridges over the Meuse River, cutting off Allied forces and capturing fuel depots to sustain the offensive. On December 16, 1944, the King Tigers began their advance into Belgium through the Lachim Gap. Initially, the advance was successful, as American defenses were thinly spread and resistance was light. However, mechanical issues began immediately. Approximately 12 King Tigers never left the assembly area due to mechanical failures before the offensive even began. The remaining tanks advanced towards Stavelot, where they captured a bridge over the Enlave River on December 18th. From there, the advance continued toward Liege, a small Belgian village, which would be Piper's final position. Only 6 King Tigers made it to Liege, with the remaining tanks suffering breakdowns along the way. Tank number 213, commanded by SS Oberführer Helmuth Dollinger, was one of the few remaining King Tigers. Dollinger's original tank had broken down, so he assumed command of Tank 2113, previously crewed by SS Scharführer Franz Fassmann. The King Tigers were positioned around Lille to guard against the inevitable American counterattack. Tank 213, along with Tank 221, commanded by SS Unmura Georg Hanusch, took up positions at Weimont Farm on high ground south of Lille. Their commanding positions offered an excellent view of the road from Triomphe, providing clear fields of fire against the approaching American forces. On December 21, 1944, American forces attacked. Task Force Major and Task Force Lovelady of the 3rd Armored Division advanced up the valley with approximately 25 tanks. The King Tigers opened fire at extreme range, about 2,000 meters. At that distance, the American tank guns could not respond effectively. The King Tigers held an overwhelming advantage, but the Americans kept advancing, using terrain for cover, maneuvering in bounds, and closing the distance. Return fire intensified. An American round struck Tank 213's main gun barrel, severely damaging it so the weapon could no longer fire. The exact circumstances of the damage remain unclear. Some accounts suggest a lucky shot hit the barrel directly, while others indicate the tank took multiple hits that accumulated and rendered the gun unusable. Regardless, Tank 213 was now combat ineffective. Dolinger suffered a head wound, likely from shell fragments that penetrated the crew compartment. He took shelter in the cellar of Weimont Farm while his crew attempted repairs. However, by then, the situation for Kampfgruppe Peiper had become desperate. Cut off from supply lines, nearly out of fuel and ammunition, surrounded by American forces, Peiper had no options left. On December 23, 1944, Peiper received permission to withdraw, but withdrawing in armored vehicles was impossible. The King Tigers and other heavy vehicles were completely out of fuel. Peiper made the only decision available. The force would withdraw on foot, abandoning all heavy equipment. Approximately 800 men escaped the encirclement during the night of December 23 into December 24, moving cross-country to reach German lines near WWII. By the end, 770 survivors had linked up with their parent division. Behind them, in Lille, Peiper's force abandoned 135 armored vehicles, including 6 King Tigers, 13 Panthers, 6 Panzer IVs, over 50 half-tracks, and various other vehicles. Demolition teams tried to destroy the equipment, but time was running out, and American forces were closing in. Many vehicles, including Tank 213, were captured largely intact. After the battle, American recovery teams moved through Lille to remove abandoned German equipment. Tank 213 proved difficult to recover due to its position on a narrow farm road. In July 1945, the U.S. Army prepared to tow it away for scrapping. However, Jenny Jinan Dews, owner of a local cafe, intervened. She reportedly offered American soldiers a bottle of cognac in exchange for the tank. Her motivation was preservation. She believed the tank should remain in Lille as a memorial to the village's wartime suffering. The Americans agreed, and Tank 213 was moved to the village square in front of the church. It remained there for years, slowly deteriorating, until local preservation efforts began in 1951. Parts of the damaged gun barrel were replaced, using sections from Panther tanks abandoned nearby in 1975. The tank underwent a complete restoration and repainting before being moved to its current position outside the December 44 museum, where it remains the only King Tiger still displayed on its original battlefield in Europe. Another King Tiger, tank number 332, has an equally well-documented history. This tank came from Schwer SS Panzer Abteilung 501 and was abandoned near Petit Coup in Belgium on December 24, 1944. Sergeant Glenn George of the 740th Tank Battalion discovered the intact tank while on patrol. His unit, attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, was defending the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Tank 332 was in remarkably good condition despite being abandoned. The crew had attempted to destroy it before withdrawing, but American arrival prevented complete demolition. The tank was recovered by the 463rd Ordnance Evacuation Company and transported to Spa, Belgium. It was then shipped through Antwerp to the United States. Tank 332 arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for detailed examination. American engineers subjected it to the same thorough scrutiny they had given earlier captures, measuring, photographing, testing, and documenting every aspect of the vehicle. The tank remained at Aberdeen for approximately 40 years, displayed outdoors, where the weather gradually deteriorated its condition. In August 1991, Tank 332 was transferred to Fort Knox, Kentucky, for display at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor. To create an educational exhibit, technicians cut open the left side of the hull, exposing the interior layout, ammunition storage, and mechanical systems. This allowed museum visitors to see inside a King Tiger and better understand how the crew operated and how the various systems functioned. Tank 332 later moved to Fort Benning, Georgia, where it remains in the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection. It is the only intact King Tiger captured by American forces during World War II. The psychological toll on German tank crews was devastating. These men had been promised an invincible war machine that would restore German dominance on the battlefield. Instead, they were given a mechanical liability, one that broke down constantly, consumed fuel at ruinous rates, and required specialized recovery equipment that was often unavailable. The gap between propaganda and reality demoralized even the most experienced crews. For American tankers, the evolution in thinking was profound. In July 1944, the mere mention of a King Tiger struck fear into their hearts. Intelligence briefings portrayed it as nearly unstoppable. Combat reports from British units described it as invincible. Every rumor about it made it even more terrifying. By December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American crews had learned the truth. Yes, the King Tiger was a formidable opponent in direct combat, but it was also likely to be out of fuel, broken down, or abandoned by its crew due to mechanical failure. The invincible monster had been exposed as a flawed weapon system. American after-action reports from the Bulge noted that more King Tigers were found abandoned due to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion than were actually destroyed by Allied fire. Tank crews reported finding King Tigers beside roads with tracks thrown, engines seized, or transmissions failed. Some had been abandoned with minor damage that could have been easily repaired on more reliable vehicles. But the complexity of the King Tiger made field repairs nearly impossible without specialized equipment and trained technicians. The technical interrogations of captured German tank crews revealed the full extent of the problems. Drivers explained that the gearbox required constant careful shifting to avoid damage, and any aggressive maneuvering or rapid speed changes risked transmission failure. Commanders reported that they couldn't rely on their tanks to complete long-distance movements. Every march had to account for potential breakdowns and recovery operations. Maintenance personnel revealed that repairing a King Tiger required specialized tools, rare parts, and skilled technicians. A thrown track on a Sherman could be fixed by the crew in an hour using basic tools and manpower. A thrown track on a King Tiger, with its complex suspension and overlapping road wheels, could take a full day with specialized equipment. In winter, mud and ice froze between the wheels, making maintenance nearly impossible under field conditions. A failed transmission required complete replacement, a job that demanded heavy lifting equipment and several days of work. The transmission weighed over half a ton, and removing it required specialized tools. Jacks and hoists were essential when replacing a failed transmission in a King Tiger, as the process required precise alignment and careful adjustment. Most field maintenance units lacked the necessary equipment and expertise to perform this complex task. A King Tiger with a transmission failure usually had to be towed to a rear area workshop, provided a recovery vehicle capable of handling the 70-ton weight was available. The final lesson came from production statistics, which clearly demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity in determining victory. Germany expended the industrial resources required to produce 3 medium tanks for each King Tiger. Meanwhile, the US produced 11 Shermans in the same amount of time with similar resources. For every King Tiger Germany fielded, America could field 11 Shermans, tanks that were more reliable, easier to maintain, and capable of actually reaching the battlefield. American factories produced tanks at rates that Germany could never match. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, Michigan, built over 18,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945. A single American factory produced more tanks than all of Germany's King Tiger production combined. Ford Motor Company built over 1,000 Sherman tanks per month at peak production, while General Motors, American Locomotive Company, and other manufacturers added tens of thousands more. This production advantage extended beyond sheer numbers. American factories could rapidly replace losses, with a destroyed Sherman being replaced within weeks. A destroyed King Tiger, however, could not be replaced at all in the war's final months as production fell off a cliff. American logistics were able to efficiently deliver replacement tanks to the front line, while German logistics struggled to provide fuel to existing tanks, let alone transport replacements. The American soldiers who captured and studied these German machines took away valuable lessons that shaped post-war tank development, emphasizing reliability over raw power, simplicity over complexity, and sustainability over capability. These principles guided American armored vehicle design for decades. The M48, M60, and M1 Abrams all prioritized reliability and maintainability as fundamental requirements. American tank designers learned that the most powerful gun was useless if the tank couldn't even reach the battlefield. The thickest armor provided no protection if the tank broke down before it could engage the enemy. The most advanced technology meant nothing if field mechanics couldn't maintain it. The fundamental truths derived from the King Tiger's mechanical failures became core principles in American military vehicle design. Today, the King Tiger remains famous, appearing in films, video games, and popular culture as the ultimate German tank. This reputation, while not entirely unearned, is inflated. In direct combat, when properly positioned and adequately supplied, the King Tiger was indeed a fearsome weapon. British tanker Ken II, who fought in Normandy, described encountering a King Tiger as terrifying. The tank's immense size, thick armor, and powerful gun combined to create a weapon that could dominate any engagement where it could be effectively deployed. However, this scenario represented only a tiny fraction of the war. The much more common situation was the one those first 5 tanks experienced in July 1944. Long marches, mechanical stress, inadequate logistics, and inevitable breakdowns. Of the 492 King Tigers produced, the vast majority were lost, not to combat, but to mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, or abandonment. This was not the weapon that would change the course of the war. Instead, it symbolized Germany's inability to match the industrial might of the Allies. For the American soldiers who discovered those first abandoned King Tigers in the summer of 1944, the experience was transformative. They had been fearful of German technological superiority, worried that they were outmatched. But upon discovering the reality, they understood. The most advanced German tank could not complete an 80-kilometer road march without catastrophic mechanical failure. The invincible superweapon could not even reach the battlefield under its own power. Germany's fate became obvious. A nation that could not produce reliable tanks, that lacked the means to fuel its armies, maintain its equipment, and replace its losses, could not hope to win a war of industrial attrition against the combined forces of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The broken King Tigers proved this without a doubt. These abandoned tanks became powerful symbols of American industrial might and mechanical reliability, defeating German technological sophistication. The war would not be won by having the best tank, but by having the most tanks that actually worked. That lesson, paid for in blood across multiple continents, would shape military thinking for generations. The King Tiger's true legacy was not in its brief moments of combat effectiveness, but in how it demonstrated that sophisticated engineering without reliable execution was ultimately worthless. That was the real story of the King Tiger.